Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp. Today, we are in for a treat. Inside our StreamYard studio, we have Sharon, Madere, and Tracey Phalen, also known as the Cult Sisters. They are podcast hosts. That's called Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters. And they're former Last Days Ministries Keith Green cult members. We'll discuss that word later on, who are breaking the silence about the culture of authority, abuse, and control that's so often found in evangelical fundamentalist spaces. Sharon and Tracey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, we're so excited to be here.
Oh, I am excited to have you here at the
The only
Spiritual
thing
Brew
that would have
Pub.
the only thing that would have been better, Michael, is if you had had like a case of alcohol delivered to our door before we
You know
started,
what?
you know?
That's a great idea. I might have to start
Ah,
doing that, right?
that
Not
is
only
a
I'll
great
send you the
idea.
questions and I'll send you a six-pack or something, you know?
Perfect.
That's great. And for years after my deconstruction, I worked as a beer wench at a brew pub in Pennsylvania. It was in the Renaissance Fair, so I was all
Oh,
in costume, and I
okay.
probably have poured more beer. I would put myself up against any bartender on how many beers I have poured.
There you go. All right. That's good to hear. You'll fit right in. Well, I wish we did have it in the evening, then we could probably drink on the show. But it's 10 a.m. where I'm at.
No
So
day drinking, Sharon. No
no.
day drinking.
No day drinking.
So, anyways, I'm very excited to have both of you on. I have a background with Last Days Ministries too, and Keith Green, but not as an insider like you guys. So we're going to hear from you as an insider. For me, I was a huge fan of Keith Green and Melody, for that matter. Keith's music, the Last Days newsletter, which became the Last Days magazine that they published. I was pretty much a Keith Green groupie. I didn't actually meet him, but I followed him avidly. His writing and his folk rock music. He was a pianist and songwriter with at least 5 albums. Maybe there were more. I don't know. It made a huge, profound impact on my life, like it did on so many people across the country. And for me, to the point of influencing me to move halfway across the world. I'll mention that
Wow.
later as we get into the stories.
Yeah.
But for those of you who aren't familiar with Last Days Ministries, Sharon and Tracey will be sharing a lot of details as insiders, but I'll just give a little summary for folks. It was a theologically conservative Christian community. Now, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, or as you call it, a commune, which was part of the 1970s, 1980s Jesus movement in our country. And it came out of the vineyard churches. It was solidly evangelical in the evangelical stream, but kind of almost hippie-like at some points.
Let me
And
just say,
yeah, go ahead.
Keith had attended Vineyard Churches, Ken Gullickson, back there in Southern California, but it was not officially
Wasn't
affiliated.
right.
No.
You're right. It wasn't officially affiliated with Vineyard, but they came from Vineyard.
Mhm.
Keith Gullickson started the Vineyard ministry in California. So also it was a close association with YWAM, though. I think that's a close association.
That grew,
That
over
grew.
time.
Yes.
Right. And other Christian celebrities and ministries, including even Bob Dylan, who performed on one of Keith's albums during Dylan's Christian years.
He also, when we were still in California, he came to Bible studies. I remember him
Oh, really?
sitting cross-legged on the floor in one of our rental houses.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were there when Bob Dylan showed up.
Yeah.
Well, and I think he visited when we were actually at the ranch in Texas. And I remember somebody saying,
Oh, he did.
Bob Dylan is on the grounds. And I was like, who's Bob Dylan?
Oh, you didn't know? Oh, you didn't
Because
know?
I
Okay.
totally didn't listen to
You
secular
were
music.
you
And
were in a bubble from the start.
I
Okay.
was so much in a bubble.
I was really into rock music for years until I got into evangelicalism and got convinced to throw away my albums.
The
So
devil's beat. You got
right.
rid of the devil's beat.
We
Right,
all
the
did it.
devil's
We all
feet.
did it.
Right. So, but when Bob Dylan showed up and had his first album, Slow Train, coming, I was like, we have discovered the ultimate reality. Even Bob Dylan is on
Even Bob
board.
Mhm.
Dylan. Wow.
So it was quite a time in our history. So, anyways, back to the summary. The tragic part of the story is that Keith Green died in 1982, along with two of his children, when a private plane crashed on the Last Days Ministries property, and that shocked the evangelical Christian world. And
Mhm.
I can remember exactly where I was when I heard that
Mm.
terrible news. I mean, so anyone who was really into the Jesus movement knew about this and heard about it, and we'll get more details later about all of this stuff. But uh, uh, as we get your perspective on things, but I have my first question is kind of a big two-part question. So give us the Cliff Notes version, if you can. Um, what exactly is to you? What exactly is Last Days Ministries, and who was Keith and Melody Green?
Wow. We're not known for cliff notes, first of all.
Oh no, I'm trying to rein you in now. Come
So you're
on.
gonna have to do a really good job of trying to rein us in. And we're actually in our series right now on our podcast. We're really diving into a whole series about the eras of Last Days Ministry. So you caught us at a good time as far as it being pretty good recall. But to me, I was drawn to a community lifestyle living that when I joined, it was already in the Texas ranch
Okay.
and started by I would have called him at that time. I joined in 1982, a prophet of God. So he was
Right.
fiery, he was passionate, he was, saying things that not a lot of people were saying during that time, as far as, I think he's known as no compromise, right? That's what the
Right.
book is called that talks about his life. That's what his
And
album is called.
his second album, yeah.
Yes, and so I would say that really encapsulates what Keith Green kind of stood for, this really fiery, no compromise character. And of course, his wife, Melody Green. Sharon probably will have more to say about Melody Green than I. I didn't know her as well. She was definitely there as part of the ministry, but she was harder to get to know. And so I was all in for doing what in the book of Acts they talk about coming together and having all things in common and living together in a community. And that's what it meant to me. And that's why I joined.
Right. So you joined when it was in Texas already.
Yes.
Okay. How about you, Sharon?
So, Keith, so I knew Keith before there was a Last Days Ministries.
Wow.
He
Okay.
visited our too much to go into, but he wound up staying at our house and our guest house in Tucson, Arizona. I had just turned 14. He had just turned
Oh,
21. He was maybe 3 or 4 months, quote unquote, saved and being very, very zealous, very evangelistic. And, it was kind of out of that whole hippie thing that was in 1975. And so I got introduced this whole concept of being a born again Christian and Jesus coming into your life there personally with Keith. And over the next couple of years, he would come into town and he'd be trying to disciple me and we'd write and call back and forth. And that was a couple of years before he released his first album. He was beginning to do concert tours around the country, kind of playing in churches and anywhere he could get a gig. The the beginnings of putting together kind of a community. They started taking people into their home from time to time who seemed to be in need. And there was a definite generosity of heart and willingness and desire to help people. Now, it always did have an agenda. The agenda was we got to get you to believe the right thing.
right. Right.
But there was true practical help
Yeah.
being offered.
Hmm.
That grew. When I went in 1979, I dropped out of college and joined. Keith had kept telling me he wanted me to come out and join the ministry, and so I did. I was 17 and moved to California, and later that year, everything picked up and moved to Texas, and that was about being able, I think, to be a little more streamlined and a little more focused on what would be called ministry, but was really pretty much the business of producing literature, getting literature out, albums, coordinating concerts, and that sort of thing. So
Right. Okay.
Keith was like a big brother in the Lord. He was my spiritual father, if you will, that kind of whole thing. So there was that relationship. Melody, of course, Keith's wife. I mean, I later became married. Keith arranged me to marry the one remaining single elder. So there was that kind of weird dynamic. But as couples, Keith and Melody and I and my then husband, we would spend a lot of time together. We were in the will to raise their kids if
Oh,
something
really?
happened to both of them.
Oh, wow.
So there was definitely a lot of proximity and a lot of closeness. Melody was not very easy to get to know. She was not a warm, welcoming, open person, and that later caused a lot of problems after the crash and as the years went on.
Right. So it sounds like you were right from the start. I mean, he kind of led you to the Lord at
Mhm.
age 14, and he was an influence on your life right from the start.
Yes.
Um, and but on the other hand, he was a very young, quote, Christian. He
Right.
wasn't like this
Yes.
big leader yet. He was just,
Well,
you
he
could
was a
say
big
a
let me
baby
just say this.
Christian, right?
He was a baby Christian, but Keith filled up the room and then some wherever he was.
Larger
I
than
mean,
life, right?
he was a force of nature. He was yeah, he was.
Yeah, right. His personality, right? I would
Mhm.
imagine.
Yeah,
So,
I think Sharon often says, which I think is very brilliant, if she could, title his biography, it would be No Boundaries, because that really encapsulates what he was like. So, force of nature, like he is going to just, barrel through and take what
Mhm.
he believes is the word of God. And, I think some people in interviews have said pretty much beat you over the head with it, right? Until
Oh,
you
yeah.
could see it his way.
I remember once, sitting, listening to Keith Gullickson, at some I don't know, one of
That
the
would
church
been Ken that would have been Ken Gullickson.
Ken Gullickson, not
Ken
Keith, right?
Gullickson,
Ken
yeah.
Gullickson at one of the churches I went to in California, or maybe it was at John Wimber's church, I can't remember.
Mm.
Mm.
But I remember him describing when Keith Green would would be in his congregation and he would teach on something and he'd look over and there's Keith Green on the front row shaking his head going, "Nope, nope, nope." That's not true.
Subtlety was not a
Right.
skill he had
Right.
ever.
Right, right.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
what brought them to move into Texas? They were in California. I know they had like a neighborhood ministry and everything. Was it just the growth, or was there something else going on? And
Well, I
why
think
Texas?
right. Well,
Why
there
not
were
just
all right. There were already a couple of or more than a couple Christian ministries slash parachurch groups and a few music. I can't even talk today. Sorry. Maybe I did get that
Maybe
case
you
you
got
here
got
that
the
from
early
you.
beer.
drink in, I think.
And Christian artists and parachurch ministries in the area. David Wilkerson was there.
Right.
Leonard Ravenhill was there. There was an organization called Agape Force that was
Oh,
there.
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I think
Dallas Home
why
and Praise was
Yep,
already
Dallas Home
there.
and Praise, Jamie well, no, Jamie Owens came later. Anyway, doesn't but there was a whole group already. And
Right.
it actually continued to grow because within a couple of years of us being there, Keith had successfully talked Buck and Annie and Stephen Nelly and Matthew
Oh, they
Ward from
came later.
Second
I was
chapter
just
of
gonna say, it
Second
Acts.
wasn't
chapter.
second chapter of Acts there, but they
Yeah,
came later.
they bought the property right next door to us, and we used to hang
Oh.
out and go play racquetball because they built a studio and a
Oh,
racquetball
okay.
court and everything. But
Okay.
I think that, I would imagine I was not privy to this stuff at that time because I was not an elder's wife yet, so I didn't get the inside scoop. But I think there probably were some burgeoning zoning issues. Remember, we got like 7 houses in this suburban neighborhood of Woodland Hills, California, and there's
I'm sure your
hippies
neighbors
walking
loved you.
barefoot all the time
Yeah, yeah.
everywhere.
I'm sure there
Yeah,
were reports, "Hey, what's going
right.
on in our neighborhood?"
Right, and we're printing we've got this old printing press and this homemade collating machine in the garage of one of the houses, and so, we're really hodgepodge and kind of, duct taped together, and Keith has this vision for, greater and greater outreach. Outreach meaning the literature, the
Right.
articles that are being written, the concert tours, and the albums. And so we really needed more of a commercial,
Hmm.
industrial sort of setting. And out in Texas, kind of anything goes, that's, I always say, that's where all the good cults go, right?
Yeah.
Texas. And yeah, so we moved there. Initially there was just a house and a barn, and we all crammed into this house. It was crazy, 14 sisters to a room sharing one bathroom.
Wow.
And uh built a built a cheap metal building. Well, I say cheap, it wasn't cheap, but a basic metal building.
Right. Right.
And began to get really bigger and expand the art room, the dark room, the printing shop, all the warehousing and those things.
Right. So I was going to ask this question later, but I think it fits in here because I always wondered, in the beginning, like you said, Keith and Melody were reaching out to poor people, addicts, I don't know, people who really needed help, perhaps the homeless. And then when they moved to Texas, I never heard anything about that. What happened
Yeah.
to that big ministry?
Well, I'm sorry. That's just fucking inconvenient to deal with people with problems.
They weren't as great of workers if you came with a lot of problems, right? And so all of a
Yeah.
sudden there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
they basically, why they started the school, right? To be able to get some more stable, trained people that
Mhm.
wouldn't cause as many issues
Oh,
as
I
those
see.
off the
Okay.
street.
All right. I
And I
always wondered
also
about that.
and I also want to point out, I mean, if you read Melody's book, which Tracey and I
Yeah, I
consider
read
more
it.
of a hagiography really than a biography. But if you read Melody's book and you kind of can read some of the things between the lines, that driving force to help people, to find somebody who's doesn't have
Yeah.
a place to stay and say, "Oh, come live with us," or
Yeah.
whatever.
Right.
That was really Keith. That
Yeah.
wasn't so much Melody. And I'm
I
not
see.
gonna on one hand, I don't wanna fault Melody too much for that because, I mean, come on, holy shit.
Yeah.
Just
No.
always pulling
Right.
people in.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Keith was the driver for that, and we think that there was probably some underlying and not misplaced resentment on the part of Melody about all of that happened.
Right. Yeah. That
Yeah,
would be a huge
having,
burden. Right.
people off the street, and also out, in the middle of East Texas, there's not a lot of street people walking around,
Right.
right?
You
We're
don't
in
have
the
the
mecca
same. Right.
of, ministry after ministry out in the country. I will say that in the earlier days, even in my ICT, we were encouraged to go into the little communities in our area and go to nursing homes. We even went as
Oh, okay.
evangelists to the churches, right? Because the
Right.
churches needed to be awakened.
Because
So
I
'Cause they're not
know.
Christian enough,
I
not
so
know.
we
They're
enough.
weren't
not.
taking them in, but we were
I,
definitely trying to
I relate to
wake
that,
them up.
man. No, no, it's true. First of all, there was always an agenda behind all these
Mhm.
things. I mean,
Mhm.
with some rare exceptions, some people were, I think, were legitimately cared for others, but it just seemed there was always an agenda. So it was like, okay,
Always.
so that was one of the things one of the red flags that I saw. I was like, wait a minute, it's always a means to an end. We don't really
Mhm.
care about
Mhm.
these people when all you care about is getting them saved and into a church or into your church or whatever.
Well, and not only did we not care about that and did we have an agenda, but we were actually very proud of it because we used to very much look down on anything that was like social gospel, like this idea. We would call them the do-gooders and we would call it
Yes.
the mush god
The mush
because
god.
the whole
Right.
idea was, well, all this good stuff you do, that doesn't really mean anything. It's what do you believe? Do you really believe the right thing? And do you have enough holiness in your heart? And are you as down on sin as God is? And so the litmus test wasn't what historical, references of what Jesus purportedly said in the Bible about what you do and don't do for the least of these. It wasn't that. It was like, what do you got in your brain? Which is just
I know
ridiculous.
you're spot on, and that's another huge red flag that was, all of us who deconstruct figure that out and go, this is crazy because
Yeah.
they're just to criticize anyone who does social justice and
Mhm.
who's people who are actually genuinely loving people and don't care where they land. They're just loving them. It just is just mindless in my mind. It's
Yeah.
Mhm.
crazy. And then the agenda is just rises to the top, to the point of, like you said, you have to believe the right things. It's the doctrines. It's, they have the right zeal, they have the right this. It's the religious hoops that you have to jump through. And
Mhm.
when you deconstruct it, you can see how harmful it is.
Yeah,
Definitely.
and I would also say I don't think it started that way with me, and maybe not with a lot of the Jesus people.
Yeah,
I
not
think
with
there
Yeah,
me
was
either.
right.
genuinely
Yeah,
that youthful zeal and that desire and this like, wow, this is not equitable. How do we make this world a better place? And so I think a lot of that is what drew us to it, and it was
Mhm.
this indoctrination. And I
yes.
felt Finney. Keith Green was a huge Charles Finney follower, and when you start really pursuing Charles Finney and that internalization of just all of your sin and how you have to be at this place of confession, it's like it was a slow boil of morphing what could have started out as a really pure thing, and it just got muddled and murky and full of mire. So, I mean, I often look at it at the beginning to where it ended up. I was like, what happened to these
Right. What
people who wanted
happened?
peace, joy, and love to becoming so
No, I
dark
and
and full of sin as the
I know
message.
it's true. What do you guys are you familiar with David Hayward, the Naked Pastor?
Yes,
Yes.
love his work.
He's got
Yes.
this cartoon, and I love it. It's a cartoon, and it's got a picture of this person walking down the street with Jesus, and they're really into it, and it's just they're having a good time. And around the corner is a trap, and the trap is the church, and
Mm,
Mm.
and it's got a little stick on it like a box. So when a person walks around the corner, they're going to pull, and then they have a little guy about to pull the string. And so to me, that's kind of what
Brilliant.
happened to so many of
yes.
us. We had
Yes.
a sincere desire to we were touched by the love ethic of Jesus, and we had a sincere desire to be good people and to love others. And then we got into the theology, the
Right.
doctrines,
Right.
the litmus tests, all these things that the evangelical church, writ large, ended up imposing on people.
Mhm. The ironic thing there for us with Keith and with Last Days is that he was so against the established church.
Yeah.
It was all about pointing out the sin and the compromise and the not holy enough and the not serious enough. So there was actually a great distancing from what was at that time the evangelical, fundamental, mainstream church. And we held ourselves out to be better than, to be
You
honest,
know,
just arrogant.
no, and I totally agree with you. But there was two things happening, all right? And he was just distancing himself from the institutional churches, and a lot of us like that, right? Because we go into our
Mhm.
evangelical church, and they weren't Keith Green enough. They weren't
Right.
Right.
they weren't zealous enough. They weren't right. Weren't quite there. But at the same time, Last Days Ministries, YWAM, they were all still part of the evangelical movement that
Yes.
still had all those doctrines and all those theologies, right?
And and
And in
frankly, in
order to
my
get their money from the big donors, they had to
Mhm.
do that.
Well,
Mhm.
and frankly, I think they became I look at the works that we did, and I look at some of the things that YWAM did then and since, and I think in some ways much more insidious, much more damaging to the fabric of our country overall, as well as to individual lives than any Baptist or evangelical or non-denominational church on the corner. I think the damage done by these very
Yeah,
influential and
right.
often under the radar organizations is substantial.
Yeah, I agree. So, but let's talk about what was it like? What was a typical day or week or period of time for you guys?
Okay.
You guys came into the commune. You were apparently they had a teaching. They call it intensive Christian training, right?
A
And,
school,
and
yes.
Yeah.
it was like the YWAM training.
Yeah, well,
right?
I'll back up just a little bit. So when we moved to Texas in '79, we did not have any official, like, that kind of a training. We'd had Bible studies,
Right.
indoctrinations, whatever you wanna call it, which we were a very closed group, a big echo chamber.
Mhm.
And the typical day before, this is all in Texas before the crash, was you have to get up at 7 a.m. All the singles are in group housing, 3 high bunk beds. You have an hour to shower. Actually, you can only shower once every couple of days.
And it's
Um,
5 minutes, yeah. Yep.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
really? Oh
Oh,
Oh,
my
yeah.
yeah. We had one septic
One
system
septic system.
for 25 people in this
oh my
house.
gosh.
And money to buy planes or lease planes, but not to put in extra septic for additional toilets. So look at your priorities, man.
Yeah, right, right.
So anyway, up at 7, uh, personal care, breakfast, communal breakfast, because there was, staff to do the kitchen, always women, of course. And then 8 o'clock, 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, enforced quote quiet time. You were only allowed to
Right.
pray or read your Bible, nothing
Yep.
else.
Yep.
9 o'clock till maybe 12:30 ish. I can't remember the exact hour, but work. Then you had probably about a half hour for lunch, and then you're back to work again until 5:30ish. Then we had what we called a house meeting, which is we all get together and there's announcements, there's confessions, public
Confession.
confessions of
Confessions.
oh, yeah.
Confession. Well,
You
you
would have
can't.
public I mean, he would have a little revival meeting every time they
We
met?
lived revival, right? So
Oh
you
my
can't
god.
come to God if
It
there's
wasn't
something
just at the
impure
concerts,
in your
Well, you
okay?
heart.
can't
Oh,
you
no,
can't
no, no,
pray
no.
for wait, you cannot pray and say grace for dinner if you're holding unconfessed sin in your
Oh, you had
heart.
unconfessed sin.
Yes. So you have
Girl,
to,
oh
yeah, I
my
think when I
gosh.
first started posting things on Instagram, I have, the scene from the ranch house because we're all packed into this,
Right.
ranch house kitchen. And at that time, there were a lot of the brothers of the ministry who were struggling with masturbation.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
And I
yeah.
know this because one by one,
Not a lot of them, all of them.
Yeah, yeah.
Come on, let's be
and
honest.
one by one, they would raise their hand
Uh,
and say that they, had to confess the sin of masturbation. And of course, that would make another brother feel guilty
gosh.
because they are like, oh, this
I
person.
haven't confessed it. Yeah.
And so it went on and
Oh
on.
my
And I mean, the
gosh.
sisters were growing more and more uncomfortable
It's
because
like, "Can
we,
we
Yeah,
just
right.
pray and eat?
Can
Can we
can
just
you
go
guys
eat?"
have your own men's confession and leave us alone?
Alright, so we would have these house meetings, so
Right,
announcements, prayer, confession, or whatever,
right.
then we'd eat, and then we'd go back to work for another few hours, usually till 9 o'clock or
10,
10 o'clock.
it was 10. And then they backed it off. Before Keith died, he backed it to 9 because
Okay,
kind
I'm
of to
So
glad
you
you
kind of
still
remember
work
that.
ease the
till
burden.
9 or 10 o'clock.
Yes,
At
at
night, yeah,
nighttime, yeah.
and
So
then
that's like a
a
12-hour more than a 12-hour
Yes,
oh,
day.
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and then then you had enforced nobody could talk from 10 till 11 and lights out at 11 and 7 a.m. started all over again. And when we did that 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, and that was our
So if I'm
schedule.
doing my math, it's like 60 to 70 hours a work week.
Well, and
Now
that's if we weren't in a
now
burn. And then
how much were you paid for this?
uh, uh,
What was your salary?
Well, I paid to go do this.
You
yeah,
paid to do
So,
it.
when
yeah.
the school, you paid to go to the school, and then we went through the first 10 weeks and the second 10 weeks, and then you went through an internship, and then you got invited to be on staff. So, when you were a first term, second term intern, you were paying. Like, there was not even a stipend at that time. And so, however long it took you from internship to staff, once you got on staff, you would start getting a monthly, I mean, stipend. Like, I
Like
think it was
10
$12. I remember
$10.
$12 it being at the beginning. And then the more responsibility you had and longer you were there, it went up from that. But
And then you could use that to buy postage to mail a letter home or to make a phone call to call your
oh,
parents.
phone
You had
calls
to
were
track
expensive.
yeah, you had to track your long distance phone calls, or you were allowed a half glass of orange juice in the morning for free you could pay another 25 cents a day if you wanted to have an extra glass of orange juice.
Oh,
And
okay.
milk,
Yeah.
if you wanted
Or
All right.
extra
milk,
milk.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay. All right. So, but were there any paid staff?
No.
No, I mean, once you became a staff member, you got your stipend. If you then got promoted to be like a department head, that stipend would go up.
What
Maybe
stipend?
100, maybe like $100 a month might have been the
Yeah,
You had to
the
max.
be
I
there
don't
for a
know.
long
yeah, the
time
Yeah.
really,
to make
really
that. Yeah.
pittance. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
But
yeah,
then your housing was provided, right? So your food was
yeah,
provided,
your
except
food and
for
your housing was provided, right?
yeah.
It's similar to some other ministries. I actually went overseas with Food for the Hungry that did the same thing. But we raised our own support. We went out to people in churches and everything. Did you guys do that to get, have
No.
you
Well,
just
those of
No.
us that
how did
came
you
in
afford
early
it?
as
And you just saved
well,
your money and
you
Savings.
came as teenagers, you didn't or you dropped out of college, you
oh,
don't have
yeah,
any home
right,
background. I mean,
right.
that's part of the other problem of, like, the entrapment, whether it
Mhm.
was Last Days Intensive Christian Training School and then coming into the whole internship and staff or Youth with a Mission. I mean, you get these zealous, young, idealistic, ready to sacrifice young people who then derail any possibility of building a career or a skill or a network, and they become dependent to where the only thing you are suited to do
Is
is
that
to
yeah,
remain
right,
in this controlled organization.
right.
Yeah, it's very,
That's
very hard
amazing.
to leave.
That's amazing. So most
So
people came in very young. I mean, not
Oh,
very
yeah.
young, very
but
young.
I
So
remember I almost signed up to do the training, and when I
Mm.
was a young Christian, and I was like in my early I was probably 23 when I became a born again Christian. So I always minded maybe 24, 25. Would I have been the oldest
you
one
would have been
there?
Yeah,
mature.
you'd have been mature.
Were you married when you were thinking of coming
No, I
to this,
wasn't
or you're
married.
single? Okay.
Yeah,
We were
right,
pretty tough on married couples. I think it
right.
is a pretty brutal school for married couples because we didn't honor, right, the marriage much at all. It was all about working and what you could
Yeah,
participate in,
right. It all
and it
began
was
to focus
very
all on the
difficult on
ministry. Yeah.
relationships.
Okay.
So
So
when I came, I just wanted to say when I came in, I was 18 when I joined ICT, and so I'd worked since I was 15 years old. So I had my own savings account. So I paid for the tuition, and then I had enough in savings to last me through the internship. And I eventually went to work as a counselor, as a co-director of the school, and that was part of our vetting. Is you had to be able to show financial responsibility to come to the school and to be able to go through second term without any other financial means, or you weren't even able to be accepted into the school.
Yeah.
I
So
see.
that we had that figured out pretty well.
I see.
I
Okay.
also wanna say one other thing. There was also once a week, we were, forced it was mandated 24-hour fasting with water only.
Once a week.
Once a
Wow.
week, we were required to fast as a whole group, and then we'd also have and I don't remember if it
Was
was
that on a work day or the
oh,
Sunday?
yeah. No,
Tuesday
no.
Oh.
night to Wednesday night.
Yeah. After
Oh,
dinner
wow.
Tuesday, nothing but water until dinner on Wednesday.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And,
Got it.
um, and then, uh, and then we'd have Bible studies and that would involve, worship as well, just guitar sitting on the floor. But it would usually be Keith, sometimes either Martin or Wayne, the other 2 elders. Every once in a while, maybe somebody else would I think if Kathleen or Melody wrote an article, they might talk about the article before it was published. Again, it was very, very, very controlled and incestuous, so to speak.
It's amazing. All right. We're going to take a short break now, and we're going to come back with Tracey and Sharon talking about Last Days Ministries. So stay tuned. So we're back with Tracey and Sharon talking about Last Days Ministries. And one of the questions I had was, when did you realize that you were in a cult?
Not while we were in it.
Not
Not while you
not
were in it. And
Not maybe till a few years
how
ago.
about
Well,
yeah, but
not
you
even
have
well,
stories you got kicked out though, right?
well, I got kicked out in '87, the beginning of '87. Tracey
Oh, okay.
left in '87, but I gotta tell you this. This is the truth, Michael.
Right.
I mean, in many ways, I was still trapped in the cult mindset, okay? Because even though I wasn't submitting to, well, by then Keith had been long dead. It's Melody, it's YWAM, so I'm not in that. But I was still imprisoned
Yeah.
in the mindset, in the belief system that kept me having to follow this imposition of cult rules. So I did that to myself. And it was, oh my gosh, at least 15 years before the cracks started in that belief system. And it was probably not until when you asked the question, I was like, when the fuck did I say that? I'm thinking it was at least 2010. Okay. Before I would
Wow.
say the word cult.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I
No,
mean,
it's
to
true.
this day, people that lived with us in the ministry are furious with
Oh
us that
yeah.
we even reference it as a cult,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of people that say it was, a very above board Christian ministry. And, I always said, you can take the girl out of the cult, but you can't take the cult out of the girl, because it is an internalized way of belief that is so impactful. And I mean, so much so, and we haven't gone into kind of the demise of Last Days Ministries, which we're talking about in a series on our podcast. But Melody took the ministry in a direction that many of us didn't agree with. And so
Yeah.
when we left still wanting to hold on to the original vision that Keith had. And so
Mhm.
we left trying to live that original vision outside of Last Days Ministries. I moved to Pennsylvania with probably 4 or 5 families that actually lived at Last Days Ministries, and we kind of
Oh, really?
recreated another
Oh.
community in
Oh, okay.
Pennsylvania. It didn't go well. It
Well, and
Where did
was
there
you
was let me back up with that. There was a mass exodus
Mhm.
that happened. There was a crisis point in the
a
ministry where
after Keith's death and when
no,
Melody took over? Or
no, this was Keith died in '82.
yeah.
Melody took over then, and there was a whole lot of shit with
A lot
that.
of that.
But it was in '86, there became this kind of crisis of confidence, really, really worried about what she was doing and how she
Oh, I
wanted to
see.
spend money and everything. So there was a confrontation, so to speak, but a godly one. And then when the response was not at all to take ownership and what we thought do the right thing, basically we got kicked out, and everyone, I would say virtually everyone who had been in a position of leadership and responsibility and insight and had their shit together over the next 6 months left. They were just gone out of there.
Yeah. So, what one of the things that struck me when you said, you didn't really call it a cult until whatever, decades later.
2010, yeah,
Yeah.
decades.
A decade and a half or whatever. You know, um, that is so common, for
Mhm.
us who deconstruct. I mean, I had the hardest time calling evangelicalism a cult. I mean,
Mhm,
as a movement, it's cultish at least, but there was a church I went to in California, and it took me years to realize actually that was a cult. It wasn't the
mm,
kind of cult where you start a commune and you move to Latin America and drink the Kool-Aid, but it was a cult
mm,
nevertheless. And it's the
mhm,
programming, the indoctrination,
Yes.
and the way of life and thinking that's just ingrained in you,
Yes.
yes,
and it's hard to get out of. And like you said, when many of us left evangelicalism, typically we leave in stages. You
yes,
leave one church or ministry or cult commune and you go to something else. Okay, that's a one-off. We're going to fix it. And then you go to the next one and then the next one. And then you realize, oh, wait a minute, there's a theology behind all this that's a pattern. Now I can get it. It's all bad.
Mhm.
Well, maybe
right,
not 100%, but it's the theology's bad. And I gotta change. I gotta get out of that completely. Does that make
right,
sense?
Yes.
yeah,
Oh, yes, it makes
yeah,
very much sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, anyways, when you realized it was a cult, of course, years later, but as you look back on it, what were the major beliefs or doctrines and actions that LDM taught and practiced that were cultic?
Well, I'm
What
going to
made it a
say
cult?
the
You already said some things, like
yeah,
the way they made you
Mhm.
work and all that stuff,
yeah.
but what else?
But it's you got to go back to the very, very beginning, back to the
Mm.
very beginning of it all. And I think it is fundamentalism, even though we didn't call it that, but it's the belief in the absolute authority and inerrancy of the Bible.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
you start with that here's this book, here's this well, we're not going to call it a collection of writings. It was an inspired word of God, but this is everything you need in totality. And the problem is no one lives it everything you need because there's contradictions, there's
yes,
inconveniences, there's out and out horrific
yeah,
atrocities.
right,
So everyone is going to pick and choose. But whoever is doing the picking and choosing is able to say, "Oh, my interpretation is the accurate one." You know,
right,
the people that don't adhere to it as fully as I do, they are the weakling
They're
compromisers.
the
mhm,
compromisers.
That's right. The people that go further than I do, oh, they're just legalistic and they don't
Mhm.
understand. You know, where
yeah.
I am, I have the right
No, you're
interpretation.
exactly right.
So as soon as you've
Absolutely.
got anyone, whether it's, the little preacher in a rural 100
Yeah,
person church
right,
or this amazing Christian music megastar who believes that they have the right to interpret and to give the right interpretation of the scripture, now you are able to choose whatever the hell you want and make it so. And so that's where I really believe the problem is. These ideas of any sacred text and whether it's Christianity, whether it's Judaism, whether it's Islam, it doesn't matter. It's this idea that this set of words have power to dictate how we live. The next big problem in it is any belief of eternal damnation and hell and punishment. Because once you have that on board, there's so many problems with it. Number 1, it's horrifically manipulative of other people. But number 2, it's really manipulative of the individual who has a good heart, who wants to do the right thing, who loves and cares about other people. Because if it's true that
Yep.
virtually everyone you meet, they are one breath away they are a car
yeah,
accident away from being
right, yeah,
tortured for all of eternity, well, what can you do other than give your entire life to trying to change their beliefs so that they won't suffer that fate? And once you link those two things together and somebody believes that, now that to me is the basis of the cult because it doesn't matter if you're now talking Jehovah Witnesses, if you're talking Mormons, if you're talking Baptists, if you're talking Catholics, it does not matter what the particular theology is. The foundation, that base of something being absolute and there being true eternal consequences, boy, you can fuck up lives like
You can.
well, you're spot on. I mean,
Yes.
I often say that the 4 major, theologies that are harmful are the Bible as inerrant and altogether true and used as a
Mhm.
rule book, and then the doctrine of hell, and then original depravity, and then the
Mhm.
Mhm.
last one is substitutionary atonement, but
Mm,
that's a little more complicated, but it's all
right.
woven these are all woven together,
Yes.
and, the Bible one is really if you don't get that one right, you're in this trap. You're forced
Yeah.
to try to harmonize these contradictory passages in the Bible, and you're stuck. You can't get out of
You
it.
are, and that was the crack for me, that was one of the early cracks of light, but before I say something about that, I wanna just go back to the other things that, in particular at Last Days, the cultic beliefs and practices that were so damaging, is the interpretation that gives excessive authority to leadership, where this idea of
Yes.
submission to your
Yep.
leaders, and then women
Mhm.
submitting to men, and
Yep.
then
Those are other ones. Yep.
the abuse of children, just awful abuse of children, and this extreme pursuit of holiness. So it's basically the foundations of what most Christians will give lip service to, but don't
Mm,
actually try to live. We were trying to live it.
we were
You
trying
And
guys were
to
right.
boy,
Yeah. Yeah, you guys were really bringing it to its logical conclusion, right?
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Confess your unconfessed sin of masturbation before we eat dinner. I mean, it's
Yes.
That's
just
right.
And that was the thing for me, because then we tried to recreate this in Pennsylvania, and
yeah,
I would say it is that death to self, right? The death to
Mm,
self message that was just so
yeah, I mean,
insidious,
yeah,
because there were several of us who took that to heart. And Keith had that song, you probably remember it, you can run to the end of the highway,
yes,
and not find what you're looking for. Well, I likened it in my Christianity. I ran to the end of that highway to prove everything that the Bible said was true. And I was going to do my best to let myself die so that Jesus could live. And
right.
it was psychologically damaging for me
Yes,
and for our
and that
families and
yeah,
for my children who would
yeah.
come along. And it's like that's where the cracks began. Like, this is unhealthy. I am not accepting any part of my humanity, and I've been told that that's the pathway to truth.
I know,
Ugh,
it's insidious, isn't it? It's just and then
so
so
insidious.
that's why what you described is the original depravity part of
Mhm.
it, where you can't
mhm.
trust yourself, you can't trust your own
Right.
reasoning because after all, if it contradicts what the Bible says, it's got the Bible's right, you gotta be wrong.
Correct, and the
And then
heart
they
is
play
wicked,
and then
always
they
wicked.
heart's always wicked and deceitful, and so and then they play the mystery card, "Oh, well, if it doesn't make sense to you, God's ways are above
Higher.
ours, higher,
His ways are so much higher
you
because his
just don't."
holiness.
Right, exactly, right. So, I mean, I'm gonna plug my book here because it's my
Yes.
podcast. But my book, Breaking Bad Faith, I basically go into that in depth, and,
Mm,
there's 12 myths or frauds that I expose, and the Bible as a rule book and all these other things we're talking about are all in there. But
Mhm.
when you give yourself permission, folks, to be able to look at the Bible and say, "Okay, I can see some good things in here, but I also can see some bad things, and by
mm,
golly, I can see some ugly things." If you
Yeah.
when you give yourself permission to do that, that will free you up completely. You will just like, "Oh, I can actually look at this book," which is not really one book. It's 50,
Mhm.
40, 50 different authors over 1,500 years, and even the book of Genesis, historians think 4 or 5 different people wrote that.
yeah, yeah.
So, it's all these different narratives, and you can give yourself permission to say, "Okay, what's really inspirational and what's not?"
And
And
what's
just
Mhm.
not.
just and just let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
Michael,
talk
you
about those as cracks, right? Those
yeah.
first foundational
Right,
cracks
right,
that begin to show,
right,
which is
yeah.
really freedom,
But
ultimately
it's
freedom.
terrifying. But here
It
I
is.
because I wanna go if I put
Yes.
myself back in the place and I remember where I was when I started reading, I think it was a book by Bart Ehrman, um,
Bart Ehrman.
Bart Ehrman,
Prob
thank you.
probably, mistranslating Jesus or something like
One
that,
of
yeah.
those. I mean, it was
Yeah,
back in the around 2002, 2003, somewhere
yeah.
around there, and, I was questioning. But, Michael, I was terrified to question because we were taught
Yes.
We
you
were
don't
taught.
question.
You can't
And
question.
so
Not
I
only safe questions.
no, I mean, I felt like I was being horrifically disloyal to
Yes.
God
Yes.
and
Right.
and just yeah, evil
Right.
to ask
Yeah.
a question. But that little sliver of beginning to the big thing for me, the biggest pinpoint of light that began to crack everything open was the reality that the books of Timothy attributed to Paul, because it says right there, I, Paul,
Right.
were not written by Paul.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that began the idea of like, wait a second, if there is one error in this book that I previously was told over and over again is
Right.
absolutely true, if there's one error, then that gives me the ability to question everything.
Mm,
And I think that is the bravest step that anyone who is beginning to question and think about deconstructing, before you can even go there, you have to allow yourself to open your mind to the possibility that it's not all true.
Yeah,
And
and I like to say that, people, we're programmed to think it's all or nothing, black and white.
mhm,
If it's one, and then they don't wanna go down the slippery slope. "Oh, if Paul didn't write that,
Right.
then I should be questioning this,"
Mhm.
and you go, "Well," when you deconstruct and you realize, "Well, that's fine, actually. That's the way we treat all history books, all narrative. We decide what's true or probably true and probably not true, and we don't have a nitpick just because we found out something's probably not true, right?
Right,
We just
right.
Yeah.
we judge it with our own minds and with scholarship, etc. But the other part of it I like to tell people is that doesn't mean, and our society is like this. We're black and white in our society.
Right.
So if it's
Right.
not it's not if we deconstruct the Bible and we decide, okay, it's not all true. It's not all true. Well, on the other side, you could say, well, I don't believe any of it. There's nothing. You might as well just toss the whole thing. And I don't advocate for that either,
Mm-mm.
because I think there's a lot of good in Jesus's teachings, his love ethic, and even the prophets.
Yeah,
So I
I
don't know
like
where you landed with that, but that's where I landed.
Oh, no, I very much agree with you. I like to say that I believe the Bible contains some beautiful universal truths that
Hmm.
transcend belief systems. These are just inherently true and apply to all human beings,
Yeah.
and guidance for life and love, and just beautiful. And there's some opinions of men, and there's some absolutely horrific things that are
Mhm.
justified in the name of some narcissistic invisible dude in the sky, and there's some frankly just piles of bullshit. It's a mix, and it's very juvenile and immature thinking that gets locked into the black and white, all or nothing. And it takes a lot of growing up to say, okay, there are shades of gray.
Yes.
And then it takes internal authenticity to begin to see there's a whole rainbow of color.
Yeah.
It's not just black and
Yeah,
white.
and
Right.
that's why these insidious organizations like Youth with a Mission, they get you in that black and white thinking in your
Mhm.
youth, right? We
Mhm.
all also have seen, I was a military brat. I came from a very authoritarian home. I was already groomed to be able to accept this black and white thinking. My world was black and white.
Right,
I think,
right.
Sharon talks about she came from Catholicism. There's a lot of stuff that already prepared us, and then it cemented us into it. And that black and white thinking is absolutely spot on. And as I became a mother and started to grow up, that's where my cracks started. I started to outgrow some of these things. And I was like, this is really hard to believe this is true when I am a mother and now I am feeling and experiencing and knowing a love that is unlike any love, right, that I
Right,
can,
right.
define, and it's supposed to fit into this Bible box, and it's not fitting anymore.
Mhm.
Right, right. So, you guys ended up realizing all these things and eventually deconstructing, your faith, evangelicalism, and somehow rebuilt something. But, um, and you talked a little bit about this, but fill us in more. How were your, uh, these actions and beliefs and practices, indoctrination and programming, how was that harmful to you and the people around you that you saw now that you look back on it?
From Last Days, you mean?
Yeah, yeah, from Last Days in particular, but
And
even evangelicalism, because
mhm.
Oh,
even when you got out, I mean,
well, quite a few of us, well, I'm not sure who else had an actual literally arranged marriage. I did. I mean, that changed the course of my life. That's pretty messed up.
really, I
Um,
mean you were
Keith arranged my marriage.
arranged it. Did he tell you you are gonna marry this person, or did he say
Well,
kind of was
he
more of a
they
subtle
Coercive
thing?
control.
yeah, so okay, so get I mean, I'm 18 years old. This is Keith
Okay,
Green, the
very
prophet of
young.
God, the leader of our
Yeah, right.
who's like, "Okay, we've been praying about this, and so has
Oh,
prayed and really believes that God is
yes,
leading and opening the
and
door, and would
how
you
can you
like to?"
question that? Right.
That's right, and then 3
And
weeks
why would
later,
you? Why would you
Yeah,
question
why
it?
would you
right.
question?
Yeah,
I'm there to
right,
sacrifice all and obey Jesus,
Mhm.
right?
right, yeah.
And then literally 3 weeks later, literally 3 weeks later,
3 weeks.
says, "Okay, how's it going? You love him? You wanna marry him? Okay, you guys are engaged." I mean, it was Keith who proposed. And
Keith
so that is kind of cultic, I think, just a little bit. Um, and I think one of the other things is this all or nothing. I mean, so many people who got tied up in it later, if they wanted to leave, especially if they happen to have a child or 2, they have no means to support themselves.
Yes,
They
yes,
have no way of re-entering into the world and just making a living and paying their own bills. I mean, you become so dependent on this organization
Mhm.
and so de-individualized that re-entry is really difficult, and I think that's what keeps some people trapped, especially in Youth with a Mission today.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
folks,
And
that ends part 1 of our conversation with the Cult Sisters regarding their experiences with Last Days Ministries and Keith and Melody Green. Be sure to listen to part 2, where Sharon and Tracey share how students and staff at Last Days Ministries were broken down spiritually and mentally, about the tragic plane crash that occurred in 1982, and more.